So Marcus Oxley is the founder of the Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction, GNDR, which he headed between 2007 and 2017. In this period, GNDR has grown to become the world's largest alliance of civil society organizations, committed to working collaboratively and in partnership with relevant stakeholders to strengthen community resilience and reduce disaster risk around the world. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me here. I feel I'm kind of at one of the centres of resilience in the world, actually. So it'll be interesting as we talk about resilience over the next couple of days to reflect and think whether the resilience that clearly we have in this part of the world reflects with our own learning about resilience in other parts of the world. And of course, what I want to share with you is some reflections and a little bit of a journey that we've been on with this resilience that we've learnt about from different parts of the world. And I think one of the things that we believe is that although the context and the political situations is often very, very different in different parts of the world, there are some common attributes and some values and principles that we consistently see in societies, in communities around the world that give us a good understanding of what we think is actually at the DNA of what makes people resilient, what makes societies resilient. So I'm going to share some of that with you and also give you a little bit of the history of where resilience has come from. So let me start. I've got about 20 minutes, so let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, so I always find it quite interesting that Marcus, 2,000 years ago, was talking about the concept of resilience. And researchers tell me that the original concept of resilience goes back 2,000 years when a Roman philosopher, a Roman politician, Marcus Cicero, was talking about the resilience of the Roman people to recover from an earthquake. So he was commenting after a major earthquake that there's some characteristic of the people here that they've been able to get back on their feet and actually recover to respond to this earthquake. And evidently the origins of this word resilience or resilient that we use goes back to this original word. So the point about this is resilience is an enduring concept. It's been around for a long, long time and probably will be around for a long, long time to come. So clearly there's some utility about this concept. It's because it's lasted such a long time. This is not just a kind of a buzzword. It's been in our societal thinking for a long, long time. This was a comment again on this kind of bounce back ability. It was made by an American admiral who commented on the resilience of the Japanese people to recover from this major earthquake that they had in 1854. And just internationally, Japan is considered one of the most resilient nations in the world. So there's some learning that we can gain from looking at these societies and looking at countries that are deemed to be highly resilient. You know, why is it that some societies are able to be highly resilient to shocks and stresses and other ones are less able to recover from them? And I think it's important in a system which is being increasingly characterized by shocks and stresses to try to understand what is it that actually is making certain societies recover. And of course, it's not just people in the disaster world that have been using this concept. It has been used by lots of different disciplines over the years, particularly around the turn of the century, around the 1900s. Material scientists started to talk about resilience of a material to endure shocks and stresses and then recover to the original state. So it was the engineers' professions started to recognise there's an optimum balance between strength and ductility. That, you know, you don't want to build a metal which is just strong but is not flexible, that you need a material that has a certain amount of flexibility, of ductility. And I've often been told that resilience is in many ways the optimum balance between strength and ductility. In more recent times we talk about absorption capacity and adaptive capacity. So it's... And even more recently, the ecologists started to talk about the resilience of ecosystems to recover from shocks and stresses. You know, our ecological systems, our environmental systems. So it's been used by a lot of different disciplines, and that means that it has the potential to be a convening concept by which we can start to bring together a broader group of disciplines beyond our own immediate discipline. You know, there's a utility there that lots of different people are using this. There's a challenge in that as well. You know, in what do we mean by it? Because clearly it means different things for different peoples. But it shows the utility of this concept. Right up now to 2015, resilience is still very much in our agenda. So this is the kind of, now I've gone up to date in a more development frame. And what we see, whether we're talking about the Sendai framework, whether we're talking about the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, you know, often we call this the 2030 agenda, it's clear that resilience is recognized as a key attribute within these different frameworks. You know, this word is in all our kind of development language. So it's made its way right the way down through the centuries, and it's kind of, it's in these frameworks. So everybody is using it. It's a potential strength to bring together some of these frameworks, but we need to kind of understand a little bit more about what we mean by it. So, are we all okay so far? Okay. Yeah, right. Okay, let's keep going. Okay. What do we mean by it at the time? Well, I think resilience is a relative term, right? Resilience in many ways is a politically neutral term. Resilience in many ways is a valueless term. So resilience can be both good and resilience can both be bad. So some people will argue that, you know, there are some very, very resilient regimes of governments. People would say the mafia is a particularly resilient body. You know, it endures, it adapts, it evolves. So resilience per se can both be a good thing and a bad thing. I just want to kind of, you know, so when we're using this term, let's not see this as the, you know, the panacea of all our problems. But first of all, let's understand it's a relative term. And in that respect, then we have to qualify a little bit about what we mean by resilience. And the first thing is, whose resilience are we talking about? Are we talking about the resilience of a company to sustain business continuity? Are we talking about the resilience of a government institution? Are we talking about the resilience of an ecosystem? Are we talking about the resilience, in this case, of a community? So first of all, we need to say, whose resilience are we talking about? And resilience is about sustaining functionality. So this is about how do we sustain some function, how do we sustain well-being, how we sustain livelihoods, how we to sustain our business continuity, our ecosystem services. How do we sustain functionality when exposed to shocks and stresses? Because we live in dynamic systems which are characterized by extreme shocks and stresses. So first of all, what functions are we actually talking about? And to what types of shocks and stresses? The Hyogo framework talks a lot about environmental hazards. But clearly that's not the only shocks and stresses that our societies are exposed to. There's political stresses, there's economic stresses, there's huge, social stresses which hit our society. I mean, the British political institution at the moment is going through a huge shock to the system caused by a decision to go through this Brexit process. That is a huge political shock to a system which is testing the resilience of the political system. The banks do stress testing where they hypothetically stress their banking systems under extreme loads and see how to build a stronger banking system. So you can see it's a useful concept, but I think we've got to kind of, what do we mean by this? Who are we talking about here? Which groups of people are we talking about? To do what? And to what kind of shocks and stresses? So the first thing is, I want to say that resilience ultimately is about sustainability. So what I'm saying is that our development processes are not sustainable unless they are resilient to shocks and stresses. So resilience is not development, but it's a defining characteristic of our development, because our development is knocked down not by average conditions. Our development processes, our societies are knocked down by the extreme shocks and stresses. So resilience gives a unique insight into what it is that is at the real core of our development processes. So these are quite difficult concepts that I'm kind of playing about with here, but they also give us a unique insight. When we peel our development processes down, what is it that actually is at the core of it? So the point is, don't just use it blindly. Resilience per se is a politically neutral term. When we're talking about the resilience of ecosystems, about sustainability to recover, is really that the concept that we want when we're talking about social systems? Social justice doesn't have a role in this kind of resilience agenda that the ecologists are talking about. So we need to kind of think about what we mean by this resilience concept. And this is where we kind of, the thinking has evolved over the time. Initially, it used to be all about the bounce back ability. When the Romans were when Cicero was commenting about the Roman people, he was talking about the recovery, the ability to bounce back. And as we've deepened our thinking of resilience, we've gone beyond the kind of absorption capacity. And of course, that's a critical thing. And if any system is to sustain, endure, to have continuity, it has to be able to absorb the shock. So if you're going to be hit by something, the best thing you can do is prepare yourself, understand how to respond, make sure you do some contingency plannings, make sure that you are alert, make sure that you have early warning systems. These are all the things, preparedness planning, contingencies. This is all part of the absorption capabilities that will make you better able to recover But clearly it's also about how do systems adapt and change as their environment changes. So if we are heading towards an increasingly drier climate, then ultimately we have to be able to modify and change and adapt. So resilient systems also have this adaptive capabilities. The climate communities talk a lot about adaptive capacities, this ability to change. And that requires issues about learning, about experimenting, about iterative processes. And it's also recognizing that there's limits and boundaries to how resilient societies can be. In many ways, resilience is determined by understanding where those thresholds, limits and boundaries are. You know, if you push societies below a certain threshold of dignity, below certain thresholds of basic human rights, do not be surprised that there is an adverse, extreme reaction to that. Resilient systems can moderate shocks and stresses, but there's limits to how resilient, how adaptive societies can be. We have to understand that. This is not a limited and limitless resource. We have to understand where those thresholds are. In social systems, that's about dignity, it's about human rights, it's about international humanitarian law principles, things like that. So the concept has moved on beyond this kind of, you know, this trying to just maintain the status quo, but actually trying to recognize that systems adapt and learn and change as their environment changes. You know, if the business does not adapt as the marketplace changes, the business goes out of business. You know, societies are very, very adaptive. You know, humans are probably one of the most adaptive species on this planet. You know, we've gone from plus 35 degrees in the Rift Valley to minus 35 degrees in the polar extremes. And we've adapted our cultures, our livelihoods, as we've migrated across this planet in those different changing environments. You know, and we haven't done that through some top-down directive. This hasn't been some grand order has come down from on high. It's we've learned as we've gone. This has been an iterative, learning, evolving process. So you know, there's a lot of resilience within us as a people, as a societies. And of course, you know, one of the reasons why we are using more this resilience term is that, you know, the reality at the grassroots level is that people live in a very complex, multi-risk environment. There's a high degree of uncertainty. It's a very dynamic, fast-changing environment. So the more traditional approach to risk management, whereby, you know, we will mitigate risk for a specific hazard type. That's the more kind of traditional risk management approach. You know, we understand the risk, we identify what the hazards are, what the vulnerabilities are, and then we develop interventions to deal with that specific type of, you know, when you're dealing with complexity, uncertainty, unpredictability, fast changing, we need much more dynamic ways of dealing with this that much better reflect the realities that people live in. The people live in a very complex, uncertain environment. There's a lot of poverty and informality. You know, it's often that where we get to the more vulnerable, the more marginalised groups, this is where public policies have least connectivity. You know, these issues of informality, where a lot of our lower income groups, there's a high degree of fragility and insecurity in certain areas. This is a very, very difficult, complex environment to try to strengthen resilience, to try to support development. You know, remember that development is not sustainable unless it is resilient to this complex mix of shocks. And also let's remember that although it tends to be the large-scale mega events which kind of get the political attention, that get the media attention, actually for most people it's the small scale but relatively frequently occurring shocks and stresses with which they daily have to deal with. You know, it's what ISDR calls the more extensive risk rather than the intensive risk. And most loss and damage to disasters is actually due to the small scale but relatively frequently occurring crises rather than the large scale, which, you know, gets the national government attention, gets the international attention, and gets resource flows. A lot of the small scale has to be dealt with at a local level. This is local communities, local authorities, local businesses. These are the people that have to deal with this. So we need responses that kind of are mindful of that and can deal with that. I'm often struck by, you know, when I talk to people and I say, you know, explain to me what you mean by disaster resilience. And they'll kind of, you know, they'll talk me through what they think some of the core properties and attributes of disaster resilience are. And then I speak to a group of climate people and I say to them, you know, tell me what you think climate resilience is. And they will you know, explain about the importance about governance processes and about inclusion and about understanding limits and boundaries. It's a very, very similar conversation. It might be framed differently. And it's the same when I speak to people about, you know, ask people what do they mean by conflict resilience. I think what you'll find is that there's a high degree of overlap between these different concepts. As I say, it might be funded differently, it might be framed programmatically differently, but there's a lot of commonality, and we shouldn't be surprised that what makes us resilient to one thing also makes us resilient to other shocks and stresses. It's a bit like we as human beings, you know, it's our immune system makes us resilient to a whole series of diseases and parasites and pathogens and illnesses. You know, we weren't designed just for one particular illness or stress. You know, the key is keeping us healthy, and keeping your immune system healthy will make you resilient to a lot of external shocks and stresses. So it's really understanding what's at the DNA, what's at the core of this resilience. And certainly, you know, when we talk to affected populations, and affected populations to me are the primary stakeholder in this process. You know, we often say it has to be a multi-stakeholder process. You know, who are the primary bearers of risk? It is affected populations. That can be the host communities, it can be the displaced populations. You know, those are the people that are the primary bearers of the risk. So when we're talking about, you know, we need to bring people into these processes, then obviously we need to start opening up some of these processes to the people who are directly affected by these. And as I say, recognise the commonality on this, and recognise the difference between, there will always be elements of natural hazards, you know, early warning systems, cyclone warning systems that are specific to a particular hazard type, that will make resilience to a particular hazard type. But also there's a more systemic general resilience, which is kind of at the core of this. So again, these are quite difficult concepts that I'm throwing out quite easily here, you know, about specific and general resilience, about trying to understand what's at the core of this, and about the importance of governance in this. So I'll keep going. We can when we go around the world and look at what knocks down our development processes, what makes certain societies resilient and recover and adapt, we see there's about kind of 8-9 principles which come up consistently again and again and again. So these are kind of some of these principles. Remember, we talked about absorption capacities. So inherently, communities that have a higher degree of preparedness, of alertness, of responsiveness, of contingencies, they know what to do, they know how to act, they know who to coordinate with, they know where information has to go, they have buffers, they have contingencies, they are more able to absorb and recover. So this issue about preparedness and responsiveness, absolutely essential to that. Many times these shocks and stresses are beyond the individual coping capacities. So resilient systems have an ability to collaborate, to work together, to group together. So this ability to collaborate and connect, it's a very human. Lots of species do it. When they can achieve more by working together. When the shock is beyond their individual coping capacities, they will work together. They will collaborate together. This informal volunteerism we see all over the world, where communities start to kind of work together, households start to work together. It can be an inclusive process. It can be an exclusive process. So there's some kind of, there's some ups and downs of this. But inherently, systems that are connected, that are collaborative, are more resilient. So when we're designing our programs, when we're thinking about how do we design interventions in this region that will help strengthen resilience and bring a developmental approach, that was some of the thinking I heard this morning. We should be starting to think about how do we start to apply some of these guiding principles, to our social systems, to our political, economic systems. Resilient systems have an ability to learn. They learn from the experience, they moderate, they adapt, they make reforms, they change policies. One of the things I've noticed in Japan, I went twice to a study tour to the Fukushima, earthquake crisis. And the one thing that struck me is they are constantly asking you, what do you think we have learned from this? What do you think we should be doing, differently? So this idea about we should be learning from these crises and bringing this learning back into our policies and our practices is embedded within that thinking in Japan. They see it as a duty to their future generations. It's very noticeable when you go into Japan. This ability to self-organize, absolutely critical. Communities that recover quickest are not the ones that then wait passively for some directive to come down from on high. They are the ones that mobilize themselves, they organize, they understand what to do. There's a high degree of self-organization. So we need to encourage that. Invariably in all crises, the heavy lifting is done by local people, local communities, local authorities. So let's recognize that and let's build on that. Resilient systems optimize all available resources. Right? So let's recognize where that resource is. Recognize where that knowledge is. Recognize who are the first people to respond. Recognize they can't do this in isolation. It requires connectivity and collaboration. Recognize that diversity gives you optionality. Diversity is a strength. So diversity is, resilient systems tend to have a lot of optionality. Transport networks, that if one part of the network goes down, people have alternative routes. Sometimes it's called redundancy. I don't like that word redundancy. It implies it's sat waiting doing nothing. But so resilient systems have options. They have different ways of doing things. If we're talking about communities, then we need to make sure we're talking about inclusion and bringing people who are particularly disproportionately affected by these crises. So remember I said it's affected populations are the primary bearers of risk. So therefore, the primary bearers of risk need to be brought into our planning, decision-making processes. And we need to open up our processes to enable the political space to bring these people into those decision-making processes. You know, high degree, resilient communities tend to be ones that are cohesive, that pull together, that have a strong sense of identity together. So social cohesion is very, very important for this. And then it's recognising the limits and boundaries to this. It's not an infinite resource. Understanding where those limits, boundaries, thresholds are. So those are the common things. That's a Japanese, I remember I said that Japan is deemed to be one of the most resilient nations in the world. That is a Japanese government model for their resilient society. What you recognise there is that it's about the individual, it's about the mutual support, the collaboration, and it's about the government support. It's not just one or the other. It's both the institutional and the institutional roles and responsibilities. It's captured quite nicely in that Japanese model. It's recognising we live in a very siloed world. We have a climate change problem, we have a climate change framework. We have a disasters problem, we'll have a disasters framework. We have a development issue, these are all development issues. But, we'll have 17 development goals. And then somehow we've got to kind of top down this, we agree a global agreement, national governments put this in place, and somehow we've got to kind of integrate all this together. A key point of conversion are affected people because they don't differentiate in the same way that these policy frames do. It doesn't happen without that external supportive environment. It requires the political leadership, it requires financial resources, it requires policies, tools, participatory processes. It requires understanding both the cultural dimension of this as well as the policy dimension of this. It requires an enabling environment to actually make this happen. It's not just about the community, it's not just about top-down, it's about understanding the complementarities of how do you get the synergy, the partnership between these different stakeholders. I would say that a resilient communities are the foundation of a resilient society. It's the base of the pyramid. So I think we need to get the foundation right if we want to build more resilient societies. I'll stop there because I'm out of time. But anyway, there you are. Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
So there's a slight change in the schedule because now we'll be moving to a small keynote where we contextualize what Marcus has just talked about on Lebanon, and this will, or on the region, and this will be provided by Dr. Fadi Hamdan. Dr. Fadi Hamdan is the Managing Director of the Disaster Risk Management Center, DRMC, in Lebanon. He has extensive experience in disaster risk management and risk governance. But before I give the floor to Dr. Fadi, I just want to introduce Sébastien Locher, and he's our graphic recorder today. He'll be recording the discussions, the keynote speeches, and all the panels. And the recordings will be placed in the coffee break room where you can just look at them while chit-chatting and discuss the outputs of the conference. Thank you.